shadows fade, the truth comes through. Fresh start in the morning blue. Hey, now blue sky shining down. Let your feet don't touch the ground. Life it off, let the good times stay. Oh yeah, it's a blue sky day. Oh, coffee steaming, a smile breaks free. Simple joys are enough for me. Stones roll out, but I don't mind. Wake up, sunlight tapping on the door. Feels like I've been here all before. Radio humming, the world feels right. Every little thing's in tune tonight. Shadows fade, the truth comes through. Fresh start in the morning blue. Hey now, blue sky shining down. Lift your feet, don't touch the ground. Laugh it off, let the good times stay. Oh yeah, it's a blue sky day.
Wow, Merry Christmas. So do appreciate you being here. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel. It is Christmas Day. I appreciate you being here. We've got so much to get to this morning, so I'm going to jump right in. We are going to be talking about our Christian faith here. We're going to be talking about, something a little uncomfortable. I'm not always interested in the comforting lies, the cultural convenience, or feel-good mythology. And I think that this feel-good mythology over time has sort of hollowed out Christian faith. And today we are going to talk about, instead of this mythology, we're going to talk about the truth. Okay, I am committed to the truth, sometimes uncomfortably so. But we're going to talk about truth, history, and raising up our kids to actually believe us when we tell them, hey, God exists. We want them to actually believe us when we tell them about God. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about St. Nicholas, not the cartoon character Santa Claus. Okay, we are going to be talking about St. Nicholas. Now, St. Nicholas is not a mascot for consumerism. He's not a soft, magical replacement for Christ or for God that modern culture has kind of turned Santa Claus into. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows when you've been bad or good. So we've got, for goodness sake, okay? So we've turned him into sort of a replacement, an omnipotent being in modern culture. And, there is a real historical Christian man, Saint Nick, who lived during a very dangerous time in the early Christian time. And he deeply believed the gospel in his life. I would imagine that this guy, Saint Nick, he's looking down from heaven and he's like, why did they do that to me? Okay. I think he'd be pretty upset with the secular Santa Claus thing. So he's a Christian guy, lived in a dangerous time, believed deeply in the gospel, and his life has been so thoroughly distorted that most people don't even really know the true story of Saint Nick, what he did, what he should be remembered for. So as Christian parents, I want to talk about how we can't afford to be intellectually lazy. and spiritually careless. And we've got to talk honestly with our kids about Santa Claus. Okay. And I'm not against pretending. I'm not trying to take the fun out of Christmas. Okay. I think that there's a way to do it without outright lying to them and explaining the difference between pretend and the truth, lying versus imagination. I think that there's a way to do it with outright lying to your kids about who Santa Claus is. He is not an omnipotent being. And I think far more of us, or far more than if people want to admit, I think that they know that their kids grow up and then they don't wind up trusting what their parents say about Jesus Christ because of what they've done with the whole Santa Claus thing. And I don't think that we want to admit that to ourselves because it's a fun little tradition. But we've got to distinguish between pretend, lying, and the truth. So because eventually what happens, I think kids discover that the adults that they trust in, they might not outright think this, but subconsciously, they trusted these adults. These adults were comfortable with deceiving them. They were comfortable presenting Santa Claus as an all-knowing, all-seeing, morally judging being. Okay, who does that sound like? And then they're surprised when their kids get older and then they don't believe them, or they don't see God himself as a morally judging, omnipotent, all-seeing, all-knowing being. They wonder if God himself is just another story. They get older. It's because, we told them as parents the story about Santa Claus, and now they don't believe us when we tell them about Jesus. So I'm not canceling Christmas or, banning fun or pretend, but I don't think that we should trade the truth for cultural convenience. So I know that's going to make some people itchy this morning, but I don't care. Merry Christmas. Good morning. Merry Christmas. Appreciate you being here. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel. All week we've got show lined up for you. Yesterday I did an entire hour-long podcast on Kwanzaa and how it's complete BS. So go check that out. Check it out. It's a fake holiday. I can't even believe that this guy McKinley, Ronald Everett McKinley, the guy who founded Kwanzaa, he's out there living his best life, has been since 1975, although he had 2 women and evidence of severe prolonged abuse against these women. He's a cult leader. He's the guy who created Kwanzaa, by the way. I can't believe he's out there living his best life and has been since 1975. He was convicted, sentenced to 10 years, got his sentence pled, or he didn't have to serve that because he reached out to legislators in his state and got his sentence lessened to 4 years. So check it out. Today we're talking about St. Nicholas, and St. Nicholas was born around AD 270. And he wasn't born into a Christian nation like you and I are. We're here in America and we're born into a Christian nation, and that in and of itself is a blessing that we have to kind of think about this morning. We wake up this morning, and yesterday I went to a Christmas Eve service. It was incredible. We talked about King Herod going after the babies, and the offspring of Eve, all of the offspring of Eve, of woman, is attacked by the snake. In the garden, the snake was punished. This was a little bit of my Christmas Eve service. And it really got me thinking about the sanctity of life. Earlier, in the show, I was talking about how, Christmas really changed, or the birth of Jesus Christ, I think, really changed Christianity. And we started to really see the sanctity of human life, because God loved us so much. He came down in our mess and off of his throne and took on flesh in the form of a vulnerable baby and was whipped. He knew that he was going to ultimately sacrifice his son, the Father, and he took on this form, and he knew that Jesus is God. We're going to get to that here in just a second. St. Nicholas is fundamental and crucial to pushing the Holy Trinity, that Jesus is God. But Jesus, he took on this form of a baby in the form of Jesus, his son, the begotten son. And he didn't have to do that. He came down in our mass, and like being human it sort of sucks. Okay, right? You get a backache, you got knee pain, and he took on this form, and he didn't have to. He came off his throne and did that for us, for sinners, and sacrificed himself for us. It's an incredible story. But babies, and I think that human life is viewed very differently now, because if God did that and he chose the human body and dwelled with us in a human body, then we ought to respect babies. We ought to respect the elderly. We ought to respect our dying, our sick. And out of Christmas came really hospitals as we know them today. And that was all because of Christians. And our valuing of human life. So, yeah, I think that it's just incredible, the human body and the life humans have that is sanctified really by God, because he chose to live in it, live in a human body. Anyway, so that was my Christmas Eve service, but I went off on a tangent here. St. Nicholas, born year 2 AD, 270, not into a Christian nation. And it's great that I get to go to a Christmas Eve service and get to hear the word and get to talk about, how King Herod was going after the babies. And you can't do that in some nations. So it's a blessing to be born into a Christian nation. But St. Nicholas, he was born into a society that didn't celebrate Christmas, and was born into a world where Christianity was not protected or normalized. Like here, like I get to wear my cross in America and not be stoned or killed. Okay. But he was born into a Roman Empire. And at the time, when you confessed Christ as your Lord, that would cost you your life. It would cost you your freedom. And to understand St. Nicholas properly, you have to understand that he lived before Christianity was legalized, okay, by the Roman state, before Emperor Constantine. Okay, this is before church buildings, before it was protected by law, before Christianity was culturally dominant. And this is a period of time the historians call pre-Constantine Christianity. Okay, there was an emperor who legalized Christianity, essentially the Emperor Constantine. And you have to understand that before you talk about St. Nicholas, because there is a seriousness to this guy's faith that is overlooked and overshadowed by the consumerism, secular Santa Claus. Okay, so pre-Constantine, Constantine Christians did not believe casually. A lot of times you'll hear Christians say, "Oh, I'm spiritual. I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, and I identify as a Christian. I don't go to church or anything like that." You'll hear a lot of people say that today. This guy was not like that. Okay, these people did not identify as Christians as they do today. They aren't lukewarm Christians. They believed with full understanding that following Jesus meant imprisonment, torture, execution, and that reality is hard to set. Like, it's hard to believe and hard to practice your faith when you're faced with that reality, that you will be tortured if you profess Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. But they were convicted. Okay. They were convicted. St. Nicholas was convicted. He was born in the city of Patara, in the region of Lycia, I think, which is modern day Turkey today. Okay, what we would know as modern day Turkey. That's where St. Nicholas was born, and he had very wealthy Christian parents who were committed believers themselves. And they were committed believers at a time when that commitment really carried a real risk. Okay, now tradition holds, from what we can gather, historians, Saint Nicholas was actually orphaned. He lost his parents at a very young age. He inherited all kinds of wealth, but he also had extreme loss, losing both your parents at a very young age. And we can't separate that from who he later becomes. Okay, so that's crucial. Knowing that he came from, this sort of humble beginning where he was an orphan. Now, he was wealthy. His Christian parents were wealthy, but he lost his parents, and he became a great man despite that circumstance, which is a trend we see all throughout the Christian Bible, right? Despite your circumstance, you can do great things. All things are possible through Jesus Christ. So Nicholas, St. Nicholas, eventually became a bishop of Myra. Okay, not because he was charming, not because he was famous, not because he was wealthy or had political connections. No, during this early time of Christianity, we selected leaders based on reputation, faithfulness, the ability to cite the word, the courage under pressure during this time where Christians were persecuted. Bishops in this era were not like administrators, okay? They were people who really risked their lives for their congregations. And historical accounts really strongly suggest that St. Nicholas was imprisoned during this time. So this was actually during the Diocletian, I think is how I am pronouncing that. But this is a period of time. There was a period of time in the Roman Empire where it was really bad, where the persecution of Christians got so intense. They tried to eradicate Christianity. And this was the most intense and systemic attempt by the Roman Empire to eradicate Christianity. Churches were burned down, scriptures were burned, Christian leaders were targeted, and this guy, St. Nicholas, is going to be later known for his generosity, for his kindness. It's so important that we know that he suffered in chains. Okay, so there's some historical accounts that he was imprisoned during this period of time, during this intense systemic persecution of Christians, and he was in chains. So he knew suffering. He knew the cost of allegiance to Christ. And this matters because St. Nicholas was generous, not because he was, soft or, he was generous because he was really grounded in his faith, and his faith demanded everything from him. So the most incredible story about St. Nicholas is this one. It's the story of 3 young women whose father had fallen into poverty. Okay? And in that time, you had to pay dowries. Okay, so the father had to pay the dowry for giving his wife or giving his children or his girls away. But he couldn't pay that, right? Because he fell into poverty, leaving them very vulnerable to things like prostitution. Okay, that's just the way this time period was in this brutal, ancient economy. And Nicholas, upon learning of their situation, these 3 girls and this father, he, didn't announce a fundraiser. He didn't do a GoFundMe or anything. He didn't seek recognition. He didn't attach his name to this act. But in the quiet, he took bags of gold and threw them actually through the window. And this is where the stocking thing comes from. So people back then used to hang their clothes over the fireplace to dry. And he threw bags of gold into the family's house. And these bags of gold really preserved the dignity, the safety of these young women. They didn't have to go prostitute themselves out. And he did this all without drawing attention to himself. Okay, so this is an example of that secret generosity that Jesus himself taught in Matthew 6, verses 3 through 4. Let's open up the Bible today, the Word. So, but when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. So so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So St. Nicholas lived this teaching literally. Okay, his generosity was not something he sought credit for. It was about obedience. It was about, not being seen and doing what Christ wanted you to do, doing what the Father wants you to do, without being seen. Okay, and that is really where this gift giving and secret, in the middle of the night, kids, that's where this all kind of comes from. That story with the 3 young women whose father fell into poverty. So St. Nicholas was not only known for his kindness, but his defense of Christian truth. And that brings us to Arius and the theological battle that happened in the early church. Okay, so early church, like 1st to 4th century is what I'm talking about here. So Arius, he was a priest from Alexandria, and he taught that Jesus Christ was not eternal, not fully God, but instead the highest created being. Okay, very important, very powerful, but not ultimately equal to the Father. Okay, and Arius famously taught that there was a time when the Son was not. Okay, that the Son wasn't with, the Word became flesh. That's in our Bibles, the Word being Jesus. And that the Son, he's always been around. Like Jesus has always been around. He just took on flesh. New Testament gospel. Right? So we believe that now as Christians. And why? It's because this heresy, this false doctrine did not gain any headway because of St. Nicholas. So this teaching, sounds subtle to our modern ears. Like a non-Christian today would hear that and be like, okay, yeah, Jesus is a very powerful being. What's the big deal that they were teaching that Jesus wasn't God and that Jesus wasn't around even in the beginning with God? So if Jesus is not fully God and that he was merely just created and he was a powerful being, then he's not capable of saving. Okay, then he cannot truly save, because if he was merely created, then his sacrifice lacks infinite worth necessary to redeem humanity. Okay, this is God coming down as flesh. Okay, so the Council of Nicaea, okay, this is in AD 325. I told you St. Nicholas was born in 270 AD 270. So bishops, they gathered on this council and they said no to this false doctrine that Jesus is God. And Nicholas was on this council. St. Nicholas was on this council. And according to ancient tradition, Nicholas, I don't know, this is not like super verifiable. So this is what historians believed happened. He reacted so fiercely against Arius, who was preaching. He was a priest. He was preaching this false doctrine, and he acted so fiercely to St. Nicholas that he actually stood up and hit him in the face. Okay. Because he understood that false teaching about Christ leads people away from salvation. And Arius was publicly promoting his teaching that Jesus was not fully God. And there's a story out there. Like I said, he became so outraged, St. Nicholas, and he viewed this as blasphemy against Christ. He struck Arius in the face. Like, imagine if Christians, like, you're speaking blasphemy. Like, imagine, I think of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, where they're up there and they're stripping on a cross during a Dodgers game. Okay. Imagine if Christians today would just hit people in the face for blasphemy. We'd be throwing punches all day long. But I thought that was kind of interesting. So because of this, he was temporarily disciplined. Now, this is according to tradition or according to historians, not super documented. He was disciplined by church leaders for hitting this guy in the face. I don't know. I can't say that I wouldn't have done the same thing. But he was disciplined by church leaders, stripped of his episcopal title, bishop. It was later restored after they affirmed his orthodoxy in character. So, yeah, that was a fun little tidbit about St. Nicholas that he's like throwing punches. But there's something called the Nicene Creed. And out of this council that St. Nicholas was on, they created this creed. And this creed really matters. So let me slow down a moment because this is a part of Christian history that explains why St. Nicholas mattered so much. Because out of this council came this creed. And this is why we believe Jesus, and why this false doctrine and this heresy, blasphemy, did not gain any headway. It was because of St. Nicholas and this council. So Arius was dangerous, this priest. And, you know, there was something called the Nicene Doctrine, or Nicene Creed. And it's not a poem. It's not a hymn. This is a long, like, sort of manuscript, if you will, or it's a writing. And at its core, what it did, it drew the line in the sand. By early Christians understood that we can't get Jesus wrong, because you get everything wrong if you don't get Jesus right. So the creed was written in the year of AD 325, and it was written by the gathering known as the Council of Nicaea. And this is where the Christian bishops across the Roman world came together, because the church was facing this crisis, and they couldn't ignore this crisis, or they couldn't politely talk around it. Okay, so Arius, like I said, this priest was teaching that Jesus was not eternal, and he was not fully God, instead of a great creation of God. Arius taught, and this was a key phrase at the time, there was a time when the Son was not. In other words, Jesus existed, but he had a beginning, and therefore he was not equal to God the Father. Now, Jesus was with God in the beginning. The Word is God, became flesh. Now, to modern ears, you know, this is like a, you know, abstract theological disagreement. But to the early church, this was an emergency. They were like, whoa, if Jesus is not fully God, his death on the cross, it means that it didn't truly save anybody. If he was created, then worshiping him would be idolatry. Okay, because you can't worship somebody who isn't God. And if he's not eternal, then the gospel collapses, really. And the early church responded with clarity, not with vagueness, but with clarity. And they did this with the creed. And it was written, and they talked about it in this creed, exactly who Jesus was. God, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, meaning that he is not a lesser reflection of God. He is not semi-divine. He was not a servant to God, or a created servant, but he was fully, truly God himself. Okay, and the creed also says that Jesus is begotten, not made. Okay, which is carefully chosen. The word begotten. It's a carefully chosen phrase. And Arius tried to, like, manipulate people and take out this phrase of the word, from the word. Okay, begotten describes the eternal relationship with the Godhead. Okay, not a moment in time where Jesus came into existence. There was not a moment in time where he came into existence. Okay, he always existed, but he took on flesh in the form of a baby, and he's the begotten Son of God, the Father, in the Trinity. Okay, so it means that there's not a moment where God or where Jesus did not exist. Okay, and we know this because Isaiah prophesies in Isaiah, there's prophecy that Jesus is going to come in the form of a baby. And the creed goes further, affirming that his eternal Son of God entered history, took on flesh, and was born of the Virgin Mary and was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And he truly died, truly rose again, and will return to judge the living and the dead. Okay, so the creed took it even a step further and said, yeah, the first advent, but also the second advent is coming. So this isn't something that we should just dismiss. And we should tell our children about St. Nick and the true story of St. Nick and how generous he was. Now, you don't have to tell the kids about the prostitution, but you can say dowries and explain what a dowry is. I think kids can understand. And what's wrong with telling them the true story of St. Nicholas? Okay, St. Nicholas stood there with the bishops, defended this creed. I don't know if he actually struck Arius, but like, that just goes to show you how ferocious and how fiercely, like this rumor that he struck Arius in the face, how fiercely he rejected this teaching. And he stood on the side of what would become the Nicene Creed, because he understood that lies about Jesus are not harmless. Misunderstandings, they are soul-destroying errors, and that if people were to believe that he was just created and he wasn't equal to God, that is a soul-destroying error. And, this is a creed. The wording of it is very precise, very careful, very uncompromising. Okay, every phrase exists in it because someone had tried to distort the truth and the church refused to allow it. And we ought to all take note as Christians. Hey, maybe we should act more like this council of Christians, these early Christians. Maybe we ought to act more like St. Nicholas when somebody tries to distort the truth. So the creed doesn't replace scripture. I want to be clear. It summarizes scripture. It draws directly from passages like John chapter 1, where we're told in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, so that was scripture, and the Word is Jesus. Okay, or Colossians chapter 2, which says that Christ, the fullness of deity, dwells bodily. Okay, so that's in Colossians chapter 2. So he is a deity, Jesus. And here's why it matters today, especially for parents. Christianity was not built on vagueness. It was not built on feelings. It was not built on traditions that shift with the culture. Okay, it wasn't built on vague spirituality. No, it was built on truth about Jesus, who he is, was, and is to come. Okay, what he's done, and the truth matters. Okay, so the creed exists because the early church loved the truth so much. They loved the truth so much that they were willing to be uncomfortable with their friends. Okay, these were other Christian or other, I wouldn't call them Christians, but they believed Christ was real and that he was very, very powerful and that he was created by God. Okay, so it was very uncomfortable to push against their fellow church, their what was their church, and they pushed back because it mattered. And Saint Nicholas, mattered not because he gave gifts. That was a very small part of the story. Saint Nicholas and the 3 women and the father who fell into poverty, and he threw some gold into the window for the women, or for the father, so he could pay their dowries. That's a very small part of this. He gave gifts. That's not what he should be remembered for, though. I mean, yes, but I would imagine St. Nicholas today would want to be remembered for loving the truth more than being comfortable. He was willing to go to prison for Jesus Christ. And he's certainly not like Santa Claus. Okay. Folklore has distorted Saint Nick. He stood firm, Saint Nick stood firm on the truth that Jesus Christ was fully God, fully man, worthy of worship. And, that is a legacy that I think that he'd want to be remembered for. So, there is no historical evidence that Saint Nicholas ran around giving children toys. Okay. And he is in no way Santa Claus in modern day, or the way Santa Claus is depicted today. He's an actual historical figure, actual Christian who did incredible things. His generosity was directed to the poor, to the vulnerable, and those facing real danger. For example, those women, they were going to fall into prostitution and not be married off because the father couldn't pay their dowry. So this isn't the consumerism style gift giving that you would think of today. St. Nicholas didn't do that. Okay. What did happen is that over centuries, Christians remembered his generosity and began associating him with gift giving. Okay. So he was a very generous, kind man. And we started associating him with just gift giving. Okay. Especially during this season where we connect it with Christ's birth, because he was a Christian, Saint Nicholas, and we started connecting it to Christmas. And over time, you have folklore layered on top of real history. Symbolism kind of replaces biography, and eventually culture stripped Christ out of it altogether. And that's what happened. Saint Nicholas did not give gifts to replace Christ. I think that Saint Nicholas would be rolling around in his grave if he realized what we did to his legacy. We manipulated it with folklore and symbolism and culture. And he gave because Christ transformed his life. Okay. And I'm not saying we shouldn't give gifts. Yes, we should give because Christ transforms our lives, and we give gifts to our loved ones because Christ has transformed our lives, and we should do it in the name of Jesus Christ. So I'm not saying don't give gifts, but St. Nicholas didn't give gifts to everybody. He gave them to, the vulnerable, the poor, and people who were seriously at risk, like those 3 women in that story I'd mentioned. Now, I'm not saying our traditions now need to be completely abandoned, but let's talk about St. Nick and what he actually did, and who he actually was. And, pretending isn't a bad thing. Children imagine, they play, they tell stories. God created creativity, okay? But lying is different. And this is where I want to kind of shift gears. Santa, pretend, and the parental responsibility, okay? Because I think that not only we as adult to adult have an obligation to talk about who St. Nick was, what the creed is, this early church, and how brave they were. I mean, St. Nick went as far as to punch somebody in the face because of their blasphemy. So I don't know. Would you do that to a coworker who says something terrible about Jesus, or says something that is definitely blasphemous? Would you do that? I don't know. If I could do that today, because all Christians are I don't want to rub somebody the wrong way. Okay. But parents, lying is different, okay, than pretend. Okay. Christian parents have a responsibility to clearly distinguish between pretend and what is true. Okay. And especially when the pretend thing that we're talking about here describes a being that uses God, a being, and uses God attributes. Okay. So in the song, we hear it. He knows when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows when you've been bad or good. So be good for goodness sake. We have made Santa Claus, the secular Santa Claus, into a morally judging being, an all-seeing being, somebody who dispenses rewards based on righteousness. Okay. Now, kids, they can't naturally compartmentalize theology the way adults do. When Santa is framed as omniscient, omnipotent, and as a morally judging being, and it's later revealed to them in their later life that he's a fictional character, it is not unreasonable for that child to wonder, later or subconsciously, if God, who matches all those descriptions, a very similar description, might also be imaginary. Right? So truth builds trust, trust sustains faith, and St. Nicholas was a real man who loved Christ, defended truth, and practiced generosity in the quiet when nobody was watching. And why not tell kids the real story of St. Nicholas? And it's such a cool story. And it's truthful. It's honest. What I just did. You can archive this, share it with the kids. This is a beautiful story. It's so much better than the secular Santa Claus, right? So Santa Claus is a cultural tradition, but it should never replace truth and confuse theology or undermine a child's confidence in what their parents tell them about God. And it's designed to do that. Our children don't need magic. They need truth. Okay. We're living in a time where they just need truth. And truth ultimately has a name, and that name is Jesus Christ. So what do you think? Throw it in the comment section. Should Christian parents do Santa Claus? I think that there's a way to do it, but you have to differentiate. Like, hey, okay, we're playing Santa Claus, but what is Santa Claus? He's pretend. Now, what is St. Nicholas? He's truth. Okay, he was a real man. And I think that story is so much better, to be honest with you, and believable. And, there's a way to do it without scaring kids. You don't have to talk about the prostitution and the Christians being slaughtered. You don't want that. Like, you have to make it age appropriate. But why conceal that story? Like the real story of St. Nicholas. If we told our kids that story, they'd grow up and they wouldn't allow for blasphemy in their inner circles or at their workplace. They would be courageous enough to stand up to stuff like that. So truth has a name. It's Jesus Christ. I pray over you and your family today. I pray that the birth of our Savior, the Word that took on flesh, I pray that his birth and his death brings you peace, knowing that there is eternity in heaven. And I pray that if you don't know him, that you cry out to him today, because it will be the best decision you ever make in your life. It was for me. So bye-bye. Merry Christmas. Be blessed. And tell your kids about St. Nicholas, the true story of St. Nicholas.